Hey, John, are you here?
I am.
There you are. Hey, how you doing?
I,
Good. All right. I do you have are you going to be sharing your screen?
I will, yes.
Okay, do you want to just test it and make sure that it works before you get started?
Oh, no problem. Yep. Here we go. How's that?
Okay, seems fine. You can stop.
Good. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Jamel, are you here?
I am. Hello.
There's Jamel. Okay, well, I will let you take it away.
Thanks, Jay.
All right. One quick note. Can you help me out? I don't want to mispronounce anything. John, how do you pronounce your last name?
Officially Weretka with a V at the start.
Weretka. Okay. All right, everybody. Welcome. I am Jamel Doherty, Paideia's curriculum manager, and I'm happy to be a woman introducing this topic. John Weretka holds undergraduate and postgraduate qualifications in musicology, medieval history, art history, theology, and Latin, and is currently a doctoral student at the University of Divinity in Australia. He's researching the medieval liturgical commentary. John works in the early music stream in the Faculty of Music at the University of Melbourne and is the convener of the university's medieval Latin reading group. I would also like to add that he teaches multiple Paideia courses. So if you like this lecture, please check those out to enroll. And if he wants to speak more about that as well, or any other things, I will let him do so. So welcome, everyone, and welcome, John. Thank you so much for this lecture.
Thank you very much. We will have questions at the end. Is that right, Jamel?
Yes.
Good, brilliant. Okay, fantastic. Let me share my screen with you. Welcome all of you. Fantastic to see so many here. Great. Hopefully you can see this presentation that I have on the screen. I am going to be talking about women in the Middle Ages, but I'm lucky in a sense that the Middle Ages can be drawn as a fairly long bow. So in fact, I'm going to talk about the Middle Ages, obviously, but I'll talk a little bit about the period in the 16th century, which is where we know the situation with women in music much better from documentation and compositions and so forth. So we're going to start a little bit in the 16th century, but we will head into the Middle Ages proper after that. So let's get started. And I have to begin with these people who set the agenda for medieval thinking about women for many, many centuries. We tend to think of the Middle Ages as made up of clerics who were busy talking about the way Eve had brought sin into the world and the way Mary had corrected that sin. It's true that a lot of medieval thinking about women probably is clustered around these two figures. And so to think, as we often do, that they dictate our impressions of the medieval world, that's not exactly wrong. But it does cloud a bigger and richer picture that we might be able to see if we look more closely at the way even women express themselves in the Middle Ages. So there are all kinds of things that just taking these two figures as nodal points, there are all kinds of ways in which that really disrupts our understanding. In fact, gets in the way of a proper understanding of what women's position in medieval society was, and also in the arts more generally and music particularly, as we're studying today. We need to take into account when we think about medieval receptions of women that what we're dealing with largely are written accounts, and those written accounts come from literate men. The literate men obviously are mainly clerics who were the most literate members of society, and those clerics often come with their own agendas, theological agendas that are aiming to show certain things about the position of women in society. That too is a bit of an overdrawn statement because there are plenty of nuanced views about women that emerged from even clerical statements about the position of women. So I don't want to give the impression that all clerics were anti-woman. That's definitely not the case, even if they often tended to do what this picture intimates, that is to draw a sharp distinction in theoretical writing. So if we think about the sources that are available for thinking about women in the Middle Ages, we tend to think about these clerics, we think about literate men, but then we're not taking account of the kinds of things that literate non-clerical men thought about women. And their records are fewer, and I'm thinking of people in that case ranging from kings and princes down to literate merchants in the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance period. So we're not taking account of that kind of person. We're also not taking account of what non-literate men thought, that is, sort of people on the street. And we can't take much account of what they thought because they didn't leave the records that historians rely on so frequently. And we're also, if we just think about this dichotomy, not thinking about what women thought about themselves. And actually, there are plenty of instances of women discussing themselves in the medieval record. We need to go hunting a bit because they're not always in places that you would expect, but there are plenty of instances where women think about themselves in literate sources. And occasionally, of course, we do have women speaking in their own voices. And that picture is also complicated because those voices are sometimes constructed voices, constructed by men. Think of the situation of the wife of Bath, for example, from the Canterbury Tales, is a very loquacious, eloquent woman who can express her position in society very well, but it's a constructed voice. It's Chaucer speaking on behalf of a woman. Now, it's possible that the wife of Bath, had she ever existed, might well have thought as the wife of Bath does in the Canterbury Tales, but we need to remember that's a man speaking in a woman's voice. And of course, when we do hear women speaking in their own voices, we're again getting a skew towards literate women. And unfortunately, or fortunately for us, because they've left traces of themselves, the women I'll be talking about today are literate women, high-class women, abbesses, princesses, duchesses, governors, and so forth. So they are the confines of our investigation into women in the early modern period. We don't have, in general, the voices of marginalised women, low status women, and so forth. And we don't also have the voices of men of that same class talking about their women. So they're the limitations, and we've just got to work with them, but we do need to be aware that they are there. So I just want to share with you two versions of this Eve and Mary dichotomy that I'm showing you on the screen here. First one is a really fantastic text that you can see here. And it is a text that derives from a novel, actually, from the 12th century, a text written by Johannes de Alta Silva, who was a monk. And he, in this fantastic diatribe against women, you can see it here, I won't bother to read it to you because you can see it on the screen, but it's a crescendo of hatred against women. Interesting thing about this story, actually, is that there's an inset series of stories which are kind of picaresque tales of their own, but the frame story actually involves the poet Virgil. And this is actually Virgil speaking at the end of the story as he denounces the evil stepmother, naturally, in the story. And he reaches an absolute crescendo at the end of this. This is my translation, and I've used capital letters at the end to indicate the way that he brings this ringing denunciation of women to an end. Women here are the depths of the abyss. All the evils of the world are to be attributed to women. And you can see right at the end that there's just a fantastic list about how women have brought anger, quarrels, envy, jealousy, dissension, arguments, etc., into the world. What more need he say, he says, and yet, of course, he goes on to say exactly what he means, that woman has brought great evil, woman is great evil in the world. So this is the kind of example of, and this is a cleric, of course, writing, kind of example of clerical writing. It's very anti-woman, but it's not the only picture that we have from clerical writing in the Middle Ages. This is another one written by Humbert of Romans, which is part of a longer sermon, in fact, where Humbert is talking about women and their position in the world, actually. And it's a very, it's quite a touching, actually, quite a touching examination of women's position in the world. It is definitely cast in the mold of the Mary image of woman, but he tries to be sensitive about the good that women can bring into the world. In fact, the equal status they have with men. He makes an argument in exactly this paragraph we're looking here about the way women are actually equal to, perhaps in some ways even superior to men. So these are two clerics who write at opposite ends of the spectrum. Their subject matter is the same, of course, but there's no question that they're dealing with the issues presented to them by women in their own way seriously. So this is the kind of material that we deal with when we're looking at women in the Middle Ages. Now, I just need to go a little bit further into history and just talk about what happened in the 16th century, because it's there that we start getting really good records about the sort of argument, the debate about women. And this is the kind of evidence for what's going on in the mid-16th century, a little part of Orlando Furioso by Ariosto. And he says here that women have arrived at every excellence in the arts in every art in which they have striven. The idea here is that women have actually reached proper intellectual parity with men. And he says, this is particularly interesting, that the way they have reached this preeminence in the arts is evident to anyone who studies the history of books. And he's, of course, referring to something kind of beyond what I'm about to mention to you, but he had in mind at least the books that were being generated in the dialogue and the debate about the status of women. What were those books? This next slide just gives you a little resume of what books Ariosto might have been talking about. These were all literate contributions to the debate over women in the mid-16th century and back into the 15th century, the end of the 15th century. They came in various forms. So the first one I have here is one of Thomas More's colloquies, fantastic colloquy actually, between the learned woman, a woman of his own acquaintance, and an abbot. And the roles are reversed in this colloquy. The abbot is actually the idiot in the story, a very conceited idiot. And the learned woman is very skillful at deflating his arrogance. So it's a fantastic examination of the way a literate woman can really defend herself against a leading cleric. Then there's a friend of Thomas More's, Thomas Eliot, who wrote a defense of good women, also in the first half of the 16th century. And then if we go back a little bit into history, we have a little cluster of things actually written in Spain, which is very interesting. They're interdependent to some extent, but the one I've picked out here is the important one, Álvaro de Luna y Yarara's book on the virtuous and famous women. And then a little bit further back again is a book written by the architect and theoretician Alberti called De la Familia. It's a little bit of an outlier in this list because most of these titles here are actually defenses of women. De la Familia is not quite like that. It's an attempt to recast the arguments made by Cicero in his book on friendship in terms of family life. And Alberti, maybe not surprisingly because he's from a slightly earlier generation, takes a more conservative view of women's position, particularly in family life, which is the subject of his book. So these are the sorts of contributions that were being made in the period after the start of the 15th century through to halfway into the next century. I just need to come back to Álvaro de Luna's book, which is actually based on something much earlier, which is the kind of ancestor of this whole debate. I have a little picture of that too. It's Boccaccio's book on famous women from 1374, which is the first attempt to write a full expose of the position, favourable position of women in society by choosing, I think it's 100 or so, biographies of women to relate through history. And it's a very interesting book. It was originally scheduled to be dedicated to Queen Joanna of Naples. And Boccaccio says in the foreword to the book that he considered the book too insignificant to be dedicated to someone so important. So in fact, he dedicated it ultimately to Andrea Acciaioli, who was the Countess of Altavilla. And his modesty is unfortunate because actually the book had a very important impact on European thinking about women, even though ultimately if you read it, it's rather derivative. It's actually based on a series of other things, including sources going back to Pliny, for example. So although it was very important and influential in some ways, it was reflecting material from much earlier and the values of that material from earlier periods. It tends, to be honest, to be split a little bit into the Mary and Eve dichotomy, but still it was incredibly important in trying to make an independent case for women's value to culture and in history and society. It was the first book ever to do this. There were plenty of books beforehand that had done it for men. St. Jerome had written one, for example, and Boccaccio seems to have been stimulated to outdo Petrarch, who had written a kind of updated version of St. Jerome's book, which was just on men. So this was an important part of an ongoing debate in society about the relative positions of men and women, and Boccaccio is really right there at the start. It's important that it was Boccaccio, by the way, because in the Decameron, Boccaccio places a great deal of emphasis on the position of women as integrated members of the company that flees the Black Death to their little villa where they wait out the Black Death. And I'll have a bit more to say about that as we look at medieval women in music specifically. One of Boccaccio's most important impacts was on Christine de Pisan, whom you probably all know as a person who found herself in a foreign court and with all of her near male relatives dead. Her husband, in particular, had gone as the court astrologer, I think it was, to the court in Paris. And Christine found herself without a visible means of support. And unusually for the time, she decided to devote herself to letters and to publish very widely and support herself as an authoress, basically. And she wrote a number of things, but two major things that were defences of women, including, most importantly, the Book of the City of Ladies. And she had in mind Boccaccio's examination of women in On Famous Women as she wrote the Book of the City of Ladies and its sequel, which is called, I think it's The Treasure of the City of Ladies, if I remember correctly. So she too, she's an authentic female voice speaking about women's issues in this period in the mid-14th century. And she is critical to our understanding of the way women were forging paths for themselves in society in medieval Europe at this time, or early Renaissance Europe. This period of ferment about trying to decide what women's position was in society produced a lot of interest in women, obviously. Some of them were admired for their freakish nature. Some accounts think of women as being almost monstrous for their artistic and cultural skills. But there's no doubt that in general, Europe was moving towards a position of trying to think more seriously about what women's position should be. And I think the role of the Black Death in that must be significant because women found themselves having to pick up the slack when large numbers of the male population, or in fact all population, but the women realised they had to take up the slack in society and were given an opportunity to do that too, or took the opportunity often as well. So I just want to talk now about a couple of examples from the 16th century. And I'm just doing that, remember, because we have very good records there. So we have a good sense of what women could do when they were, as it were, more liberated. And I want to talk first of all about this person, Margaret of Austria, who is most important to us actually because she was a female governor of the Netherlands, the Burgundian Netherlands. She's a fascinating figure, and I mean that at a personal level actually, because we know enough about her in terms of her history and her personality to know what she was like as a person. Her story is important. So she was the child of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I and the sister of Philip the Handsome. And in the 1490s, I think it was, there was a planned double marriage between these two heirs of the Habsburg family and the heirs to the Spanish throne. the famous double marriage between those two houses. Before that, Margaret had actually been betrothed to the person who became Charles VIII of France. So he was at that time a child, the Dauphin of France. He realised his political aspirations would be better served if he dumped her and married somebody else more convenient. So I think he married a Breton princess, if I recall correctly, ultimately, in order to make sure that Brittany fell under French sway. And so Margaret was jilted, and that left a scar on her. Then in the 1490s, she and her brother entered into the double marriage with the Prince of the Asturias and the Infanta in Spain. Unfortunately, Margaret married Prince Juan, and Prince Juan died very soon after they were married. So she was left a widow pretty quickly. Then for a while she was unmarried, and then eventually she married Philibert II, the Duke of Savoy, in 1504. And they had quite a happy life together and managed to found a monastery and do certain other important works. But he again died. And so in 1504, she was left a widow again. And she went into this image that we see here. She adopted a persona, the persona of the ever-grieving widow. And she ultimately came to establish a court in the Netherlands, particularly Mechelen, and I'll show you a picture of her court in a second, where she gathered a number of musicians to her service. She was highly, highly skilled in music and in all kinds of other cultural endeavours. But this idea that she was the perpetually grieving widow actually cultured her musical composition selections, her commissions, her artworks, and so forth. I'll show you an example of that in just a second. Here is a little description of precisely how skilled she was. And we just notice particularly in the first sentence that the court poet Jean Lemay says about her that besides feminine work of sewing and embroidery, she is excellently skilled in vocal and instrumental music, in painting and in rhetoric, and in the French as well as the Castilian language. He also goes on to mention that she had amassed a considerable library, which is true. She was one of the owners of the Très Riche of the Duc de Berry at one point. So she was a really substantial intellect in her time and gathered a very important court around her. Where that court was here at Mechelen. You can still go to see this. This is a little photograph taken through the front gate looking into the formal courtyard of her palace, the Hof von Savoy in Mechelen. And it was here that she gathered her musicians, including Pierre de la Rue, who was her favourite composer. She also loved Josquin and many other composers of that period, like Benoit and so forth. And I have, just after this slide, just a fantastic image of one of her commissioned musical manuscripts. This is an absurd manuscript. It's a manuscript that's a dance manuscript. A dance manuscript is itself already a little bit odd because instrumental musicians didn't necessarily need music to work from. They would they'd improvise music on top of known bass patterns and so forth. So the idea of having a dance manuscript is a bit strange in itself. This dance manuscript cannot possibly have been used by real musicians because it's on vellum that's been dyed black, then with the music inked in on golden lines in silver. And this, as I say, it's not a manuscript that could ever have been used, but it buys into the whole self-image that Margaret had of the ever-grieving widow, that it's been prepared on this dyed black vellum. So she was an amazing figure, someone with a strongly etched character, someone that we can still see through documents and surviving objects like this. Developed a public persona that she lived through her artwork. And this manuscript and other things are kind of real examples of how incredibly self-defined she was, actually. Another person who is slightly earlier than this, who's also kind of important in the story of early modern woman, is this figure, Isabella d'Este. She was, again, a noble woman, called here the Duchess of Mantua after her marriage to Francesco Gonzaga in Mantua. But she's actually from Ferrara. Ferrara, at the time she was born, was controlled by her father Ercole I d'Este, who I think probably was a fairly cultured man, but went out of his way to establish a court in the 1490s in particular that was self-consciously artistic. And he did this in a variety of ways by amassing one of the most impressive choirs at the time at his court, and commissioning manuscripts and putting on, for example, one of the first performances, one of the plays of Plautus in Latin. So he was self-consciously artistic, and he was self-consciously artistic as a cultural domination tool, as a political tool, basically. But he passed on to his daughter, Isabella, a real passion for music, and she was very highly trained in singing, in lute playing. She had one of the most famous lute players of her generation as a teacher. And the court itself was very instrumental in popularising the viola da gamba, which in the 1490s was a relatively recent import from Spain. They had connections, his family had connections to the papal court of Alexander VI. And so this was a very important court culturally, and Isabella was a product of that. She had a daughter who was also very important musically, namely Eleonora, and I just have here in this slide this magnificent spinet that was made for Eleonora Gonzaga once she'd become Duchess of Urbino. And this is another example of the kind of direct patronage that women could exercise over material objects and cultural products of various kinds. It's another very beautiful close-up that you can see here of the inlay work and the rows of this keyboard. Both Isabella and Eleonora were important patrons of composers, and Eleonora in particular, and also Isabella, I think, they were both interested in the sponsorship of the art form called the frottola, which is an early kind of secular song, which was cultivated in their courts. It's interesting that their husbands actually specialised in more serious polyphonic works, if I can put it that way. The women in the court had their own kind of music, which was this frottola style, very melodic, quite jaunty kind of style of music, that ended up being a school of its own, actually, and it came into being because of women's interest in music, specifically in this period in the early 1500s. Now, I've just shown you those examples just because we know so much about music and women in this period, but I now want really just to focus on the Middle Ages for the time we have remaining, just to talk about what we can know about women in that period. We can draw some inferences about the general trends actually from where this story ends up in the mid-16th century and the end of the 15th century. But the process is very slow, the documentation is very patchy, and so we get a rather incomplete picture. But what we do get gives us a sense that there was a real culture of women involved in music at all kinds of levels, including composition and the commissioning of compositions. So I've got it initially just a couple of instances of women speaking in their own voices in poetry of this period. I say women speaking in their own voice is very hard actually to know precisely that this is a woman speaking in her own voice. It's certainly someone speaking in the voice of a woman. Here, a very famous poem that's rather corrupt. I've just given you a translation of two verses from it here, which is, the story is stereotypical, which makes me suspicious that it's really a woman speaking, but it's at least possible. The nun who finds herself locked in the convent when she'd rather be somewhere else. This was a stereotype of medieval poetry, but as with many stereotypes, it probably didn't come from nowhere. So even if this is a man speaking in the voice of the nun who finds herself imprisoned in the convent, I don't think we should necessarily dismiss it as not representative of women's experience. There is probably something in here. We'll have a look in a moment at the case of Hildegard of Bingen, who was promised as a child to a monastery and did go there as a teenager, and One thinks of the position of the Venerable Bede, for example, also offered as what's called a child oblate to a monastery. So in those two cases, the experience was positive, but I suspect that there were many, many people offered as children to monasteries who were basically institutionalized and knew nothing else, probably some of them very unhappy. So this poem is from that tradition. It's clear from the context it's a little bit satirical, but this is a woman speaking, even if it's a man writing the poem. We just don't know, it's anonymous. Here's another one, which also reflects probably what was a real experience. This is from the collection of the Carmina Burana. Again, this is my translation where I've tried to give a sense of how colloquial the tone of this poem is actually. Again, this is a stereotypical poem in a sense, although if you read the whole collection of the Carmina Burana, it's not that commonly represented in that collection. This type of stereotypical poem is not that heavily represented in the Carmina Burana collection, but it is more widely in medieval poetry. And here we just find the stereotypical story of the woman who finds herself pregnant after an illicit love affair. It's quite a long poem, and the woman doesn't have a good time of it in the end. So you can see that she's punished by her father and her mother at the end of this selection I've given here. The Carmina Burana has a number of poems actually that are spoken in the voices of women, which is very interesting because we know in general that the Carmina Burana were the product of the Goliards, who were wandering scholars in medieval Europe. Some of the poems are written macaronically, so partly in early forms of German and partly in Latin, but mainly in Latin. And there's a quite obscene poem, which I didn't think was quite right for this presentation, which is actually written macaronically, which is a kind of, it's a forcible sexual scene. I don't know if it's quite right to call it a rape, it might be. But it's ingeniously constructed as a piece of poetry, and it's written in the voice of the woman. So this is another interesting example of the way women are allowed to speak, maybe not with their own voices, but their experiences speak in these poems. I've introduced the Carmina Burana here because we know that the music was actually sung. How do we know that? Because the great manuscript of the Carmina Burana actually has musical notation associated with it, not with all of the songs. I think about a quarter of them in the collection have notation. It's very difficult to work out what the notation is talking about because it's written in what's called unheighted pneumatic notation. You can see here, this is the Wheel of Fortune from the Carmina Burana, and it's the poem Fus et Nefas from the collection number 19. And you might be able to see, if you can get close enough to the screen, that there is a series of dots and dashes written above the lines with no indication as to pitch. This is this notation style called unheighted pneumatic notation. And because there's no proper indication of pitch, it's impossible to work out what the melodic contour is. These signs, which we'll use more widely just than the medieval period, I mean, they go back to late antiquity, in fact, they are there to prompt the memory that already knows how the song goes. And so in this particular case, the tune is now lost entirely, and there's really no way, I think, of reconstructing precisely what these songs were. But it does mean, I think, that songs like the one we were just looking at before, the pregnancy song, that is actually a song potentially. And it just goes back to reminding us that the word Carmen, at least in medieval Latin, and certainly I think back into the classical period, does mean either a poem, as in a fixed text that's in poetic form, and a song. And in the Carmina Burana collection, we see very obviously the permeable boundaries between sung object and read object. And the poem we were just looking at, the pregnancy poem, there's every chance that might have been sung, and might have been sung by a woman as well, speaking in the voice of the character of the poem. We know absolutely that women were very deeply involved in musical experiences. And I'll just take you back to this illumination from 1374. It's a later version, but the text is from 1374. from Boccaccio's On Famous Women, showing a group of women musicians playing all kinds of things, actually. If you look at medieval illuminations of people playing instruments, for example, I spent too many hours looking at the Cantigas de Santa Maria. It's not always clear who the women in the picture are. I don't think medieval people were that precise, unfortunately, about delineating men and women in musical groupings like this. And they're also, by the way, not very good at representing the instruments themselves. But here, unambiguously, there is a group of women playing, one playing a little guitar by the look of it, and two, I think, playing wind instruments of some description in a little ensemble. And this kind of thing happened all the time, and particularly in France and in Germany to some extent, there actually, there are names for these women. Joglareza, for example, is one of the words that was used in France to describe a woman jongleur, basically, an itinerant player. So we do know that women were playing musical instruments. And it's clear from other things like literary sources that women were encouraged to learn how to play instruments as a kind of social accomplishment as well. One of those in particular is the example of Boccaccio in the Decameron. We hear constantly of women picking up instruments and playing. In fact, each of the days of the Decameron ends with a musical composition. It's often led by the queen of the day. And we learn that Fiammetta and Lauretta and so forth, they pick up an instrument and start playing. And in fact, women musicians in the Decameron outnumber male musicians by a considerable margin if you read these little concerts that occur at the end of each day. I'm showing here to another literary source that we have that indicates that women played. This is an author portrait of Gustave JohnStrasbourg, who wrote the poem Tristan, and he says in that poem, he's talking about the young Isolde. And I'll just read you a little quotation. He says, "Here is what fair Isolde did. She quickly mastered the pick of his attainments, her teacher's attainments, and diligently pursued whatever she took up. The tuition she had already received stood her in very good stead. She had previously acquired a number of refinements and polite accomplishments that called for hands or voices. The lovely girl spoke the language of Dublin and French and Latin, and she played the fiddle excellently in the Welsh style. Whenever they played, her fingers touched the lyre most deftly and struck notes from the harp with power." And so in this culture of Gottfried von Strasbourg, talking actually about, remember, the story is really a Celtic story, and that's why there's these references to the language of Dublin and the Welsh style and so forth. He's reflecting what he thinks happened in the Celtic world, but in the period in which Gottfried was writing Tristan, the idea that women would pick up instruments and start playing for their own amusement, for the amusement of others, and as a mark of their accomplishments was completely standard. Gottfried, remember, left the Tristan unfinished at the end of his life, but this is definitely a core quotation from his work. So we know that Isolde was a musician, a highly skilled one in his period. There's also this case, the case of the monastery of Las Vegas in Burgos in Spain. This is a very interesting case because there is a musical manuscript present in the monastery of Las Vegas, which has been there forever. The manuscript comes from 1300, but the monastery was actually founded a fair bit before that by a foundation by a papal bull in 1187, if I remember correctly. Founded as a royal foundation by Eleanor of Castile, so under a woman's auspices, although a powerful and high-ranking noblewoman, obviously. And founded as a women's institution, obviously. In about 1300, this manuscript, the Codex Las Vegas, was put together, and it contains 45 monophonic, that is just purely melodic pieces, and more interestingly, 141 polyphonic pieces. This is very interesting because the history of polyphony, or music written in many parts, is that it was an elite art form that was entrusted to certain trained individuals only, normally men. And the idea that a women's monastic institution like Las Vegas would have a major manuscript that was about 80% probably, or 70% polyphonic pieces for performance within the monastery. That is an unusual occurrence, and it speaks to female investment in elite music making behind the walls of these monasteries that scholars have become increasingly aware of. This is not the only example of this, but the idea that women would be involved in polyphonic performance was very scandalous to male clerics in particular, and there were repeated, particularly episcopal, so local bishop injunctions on monasteries to stop performing polyphonic music. The fact that several orders had to be issued indicates that it kept on going on. So this is a very substantial, important manuscript to reflect something that's probably happening quite a bit behind the walls of convents and monasteries. We don't always have good information about this because it was a bit illicit. What happened in the monastery stayed in the monastery insofar as it could be controlled. But clearly these women at Las Vegas were very skilled in polyphonic musical composition and performance, assuming that the works were composed within the walls of the monastery as well. As composers, it's a little bit hard to work out what the role of medieval women was, just because there are so few compositions surviving. I've referred already to the example of the Decameron, and if you read the concerts at the end of each day, the queen or king of the day calls on one of the characters to start the musical performance. The normal pattern is that some people will pick up an instrument and start playing, and somebody sings. And very often that's a woman. I think something like 7 out of the 10 days that poem is spoken by a woman. The woman sings, actually, she sings the poem, and the context seems to be that she's making it up on the spot. And this means that she is making up a poem on the spot and singing it simultaneously. And that means that woman is a composer. Unfortunately, there is no music surviving from this experience. And for all we know, there never was any such music, but it reminds us of the close connection between poetry and music that existed in the medieval period, and how much is lost because the art was largely an improvised one. The idea that people would make up poetry on the spot and sing it to their own accompaniment was very far from unusual, even into the early modern period, like the end of the 1400s, the start of the 1500s. This was still going on, often with a gloss of some antiquity. People would pick up a stringed instrument and pretend to be Orpheus playing, for example. But it was very normal in the Middle Ages for this to occur. We know too from other literate sources, there are at least 2 from the 13th century. They are Provençal sources. Garin Lebrun's about 1200 book called Enseignements, and Ammonieu de Sesca in the period right at the other end of the century in the 1290s. The Enseignement de la Doncella, also telling women that they should compose music. So evidently this was going on. It's just we have so little material left to indicate that that was going on. We have some suspicion that this woman, who is very famous as an author, Marie de France, who she is, we don't know exactly. The name just comes from interior evidence in her lay, her Breton style lay, that she was a composer and a poetess. So the boundary between these two things is very permeable. And she's most famous for having written these lays, which she says were written on Breton models. In fact, she says she got the stories from them. And she cited in other sources as what's called a trouveresse, that is the female version of a troubadour. And there were a number of these who were active in the period in which Marie de France lived in the 12th century and the early 13th century. Again, we have no music from her, but it seems obvious that she was a poet of some kind. She was a poet, but she was a composer of some kind as well, which the music doesn't survive. Somebody's music who does survive is the Constance de Dia, who was a troubadouriste. That is the female version of the southern French version of the troubadours. She was the female version of the troubadour, which is in the south. The trouvères were in the north. So the Comtesse de Dia was a troubadouriste, and she's one of several that we know from the period, but the only one from whom we have music, and this is actually her music. It's if we think about how women represent themselves in music, we can't tell from this piece that it's written by a woman. This is just standard trouvère or troubadour music, but it is precious because it's the one example that we have from the troubadourists of southern France of actually notated music. There are 20 troubadourists that are indicated between 1170 and 1260, this being the only composition, the one you can see on the screen. And then in the north, where Marie de France lived, the Trouvères, there are 15 surviving works in that corpus, and 5 of them have melodies. So again, a very precious legacy. But women in both of these schools account for only 1% of the total output. So probably untold riches have been lost along the way. The most important case that I need to draw to your attention, and the one we'll be finishing with today, is just this person. The Paideia Institute is running a reading course on her material, which I'm looking forward to participating in, Hildegard of Bingen. She is, like the other women in this story, a high-class woman who, as I mentioned before, was offered as a child oblate to the monastery that she eventually joined. She became a highly important person in all kinds of fields, quite breathtaking intelligence, actually. Person who commanded princes, emperors, and so forth, went on a preaching tour in the 1160s and 70s, I think, wrote across the spectrum in scientific works and poetry and so forth. But she's most famous to us actually because of the material that she amassed seemingly from the 1140s and particularly into the 1150s, when she began writing down her visions and composing music. And you see her actually in this picture here under divine inspiration with her attendant Volmar, an authorized priest who was engaged to help her write down her visions. The last slide I have here is actually an example of her music. She wrote a cycle of liturgical pieces in various forms that appear to have been used liturgically by female performers in a number of different centres in Germany, in her own monastery at, originally at Dizzy-Bodenberg and then at Rupertsberg. And this material was circulated elsewhere to places like Trier, for example. And the page I'm showing here is actually one of the most important compositions in this Reason Codex, one of the 2 codices that was produced towards the end of her life, showing her play, her morality play, which is the Ordo Virtutum. And this is an incredible piece because we have here a theatrical work. I have to put that in air quotes because I'm not sure that it would have been staged as we understand staging. It's a theatrical work where the poetry is written by a woman and the music is also written by a woman, and the manuscript was probably also produced within the context of a female monastic enclosure. So we have, unusually in a composition like this, a complete chain from beginning to end explaining how this work came into being, and women are there every step of the way. And this is incredible because Hildegard's music is very personal. It's not like material that was written in her context. If you sing this music as I have, you realize how incredibly unusual it is. And it's a huge collection of music. She is the most substantial composer, particularly by name, that we probably have in the 11th and early 12th century. So a phenomenally important person. She's turned out to be important in more ways than one, though, because for us particularly, she's drawn our attention back to women in this period, particularly from the 1980s when there were doctoral dissertations and CD recording projects to record her music. She has come into our lives as the leading medieval woman in the field of music. And as a result, she's allowed scholars and performers and thinkers about music, even the students I teach, to think seriously about the ways in which music and women have interacted with each other over the course of history, and how women's voices have been marginalized. And it's been a great pleasure to reveal to you here at least some of that story. So I hope that's been interesting. I really look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, John. Jamel had to step out, so I'm going to moderate the questions. We definitely have time for some. And I wonder if people could try raising their hand, or if you want, just speak out if anyone has them. While people are thinking, I have something that I'm curious about. I know that like you are a performer as well, right, of music, and you're a professional performer first, and have now sort of also begun to act as a scholar. You're finishing a PhD. I'm curious, like, what it's like to come to the study of this stuff from the perspective of a performer. What are there questions that you had in your head from the practice of performance that you wanted to answer that have motivated your study? Or what's it like to be a scholar of these questions who also has this serious engagement with the material in another way?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I did start life as a performer exclusively of the music, and I think for the first part of my career singing this music, I wasn't entirely sure how how medieval music sort of passed itself. It's when you first approach medieval music, to some extent it seems the music all sounds similar, and you realize when you get into it how utterly unlike each other the pieces are and the composers are and so forth. And I mention that particularly about Hildegard, who has such a distinctive voice as a composer. You cannot mistake her. She's not the only one either. There's a famous writer who is in her context called Notka Babulus, who also has a very distinctive style. So at least one thing I've learned over time is how very distinctive the known composers are. One thing that's become very important to me in recent years because of my engagement with the Latin texts is actually how sensitive composers are to Latin syntax. Even going back into the Gregorian chant period, if you actually know enough about Latin syntax, you realize that they have constructed the melodies of Gregorian chant in such a way as to be revelatory of the syntax. And that's the kind of thing that would have been absolutely obvious to someone living in the time using Latin on an ongoing daily basis. But for us, we have to learn that. And that's been a real revelation to me to understand that there is a very profound connection between text and music at the level of grammar that you can only work out when you know both of them well enough.
Thank you. Yeah, that's amazing. Are there other questions? We can also.
Hi, I'm Amelia, and it's great. It was a great talk. So I was wondering about the Byzantine aspect of things, if you've looked into it at all, and the nuns who are composing in Greek.
Yeah, I don't know too much about that. I mean, that's a whole other thing, obviously, but one of the first female composers we do know about at all actually comes from that very context, that we know by name, obviously, comes from that context. The name, unfortunately, has just escaped me just now, but Byzantine music comes from a different place intellectually in some ways from Western music. And yeah, that's not something I have studied closely. But I would say one thing, which is the page that I showed from the Carmine Burana with its unheighted pneumatic notation, that's actually something that traces its origin back to the Byzantine tradition, in fact. The unheightened pneumatic notation originally came about from what's called ekphonetic notation, which is to indicate how biblical verses were to be spoken aloud with the appropriate emotional and rhetorical inflections. And it was adapted into the Western system to try to indicate pitch patterns, basically. So that's something that's come directly between the two traditions.
Thanks a lot, John. Sorry, Amelia, I put you on mute because we were getting some feedback through your mic as John was talking.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm on my phone, but anyway, I'm in Brisbane at UQ, so hopefully we can continue the conversation, you know, in person at some point.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, we didn't note this, but John is joining us from Australia, so you know it's 7 p.m. here in New York, and what is it, like 9 a.m. there?
Yes, yep.
That's also amazing. Okay, we've got some other questions. Leah, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have two closely related questions, if that's all right. Okay, so you mentioned that Hildegards' music circulated at least as far as Trier, so I'm curious if it was performed outside of her monastery. And my other question is, can you make any interesting comparisons about the music that nuns were performing, like at Bingen and Las Vegas on one hand, and more secular female performers like the jongleuses that you talked about?
Yeah, I can do the second question first, I think. In general, if you look at what we have surviving of secular music and what we have surviving of particularly monophonic sacred music, there isn't a huge difference between the two in terms of style. There are those moments where a personal voice expresses itself in a particular way, and for me, Hildegard is like that. Her personal style is absolutely unmistakable. And if you read the story of the reception of Hildegard, and you read the scholarship, you realize that scholars are constantly talking about the fact that Hildegard's music doesn't appear to be highly dependent on, for example, Gregorian chant. It's not like that. It's a personal style. And it reveals itself in melodic patterning, and particularly in things like range. The range of Hildegard's music, just the sheer range that it occupies in musical space, is pretty impressive. And she must have had extraordinary singers at her disposal to navigate this music. I know from my own experience that finding an appropriate pitch at which to sing a Hildegard chant is actually very hard because it is just so rangy. And it's also very exhausting to sing because it has very, very long phrases. So she clearly had at her disposal people who were very, very skilled. Reminds me of the later example of Vivaldi's orphanage children that were trained, to within an inch of their lives. The nuns under Hildegard's control must have been incredibly skilled. But those local instances aside, there doesn't appear to be any difference between kind of a female versus male, for example, or music written within a monastery as opposed to outside a monastery. That doesn't appear to be the criterion distinguishing the two. And I've forgotten your other question. Oh, it's about monasteries. Yeah. I think in general, from what I understand, Hildegard's music was performed basically exclusively in monastic contexts. And there was obviously a sort of international network of monasteries all communicating with each other, particularly in geographically confined locations like Western Germany or places like that, as well as an international one. I mean, there were, like the monastery of Corby, for example, manuscripts being traded from one place to another constantly. But it seems clear from the way Hildegard has organised her music that it was meant to be understood as a liturgical cycle to run through the year, which points to a liturgical performance. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, we've got some questions in the chat, which I'm just going to read out loud, John, and then you can answer them. So first, Diana Myers is saying, "Hey, John, that was great. I feel like I'm on one of those shows where I'm reading, emails from the viewers. Hey, John, that was great. Could you speak about some geographical differences across Europe? Do we have enough evidence to be able to speak of regional women's styles?
Yeah, the answer to the second question is definitely not, because there just isn't enough surviving material from women to be sure about that. Geographical differences across Europe, in general, I think not too. There are schools that pop up from time to time and in place to place. Particularly, that becomes clearer as we get to the end of the 1300s. So, for example, a repertoire I've worked on a bit called the Ars Subtilior was quite localized to the papal court in Avignon, a court in Cyprus, one or two other places. So that's an instance where the music has developed a geographical specificity. And then certainly later on into the 16th century, you get much better, much clearer geographic specificity. But I think in terms of medieval music, I don't think in general there's a strong distinction between music produced in this place or that place. To remember too, the entire corpus of medieval music isn't enormous. So we have a very incomplete picture, basically.
Thanks. Next question's from Dawn Mitchell, our old friend. Hi, Dawn. She asks, what text in particular would you start to look at to see this Latin syntax sensitivity that you speak of? So can you be specific about where you would see that phenomenon?
Yeah, there actually was a doctoral dissertation, in fact, written in Australia by a woman called Catherine Jeffries a decade ago, who looked specifically at this question of syntax and its handling in its musical realization in the works of Hildegard of Bingen. So she actually specifically analyzed the Latin syntax and tried to coordinate it to musical contour and phraseology and so forth. I have to say, in general, my impression of the link between text and syntax comes from doing both. And if you just sit there and think sensitively as a musician about what the composer is doing, then you do leave with an impression that there is a real logic involved about why phrases end in ways they do, that they end in particular places, even down to where it's most natural to take a breath in a piece of plain chant is determined by the syntax. You've got to remember that there was always originally just the word, and the idea was actually to make the word comprehensible. And that would, I think, almost necessarily presuppose that the music somehow served to underline the syntax. And yeah, in my experience as a performing musician and someone who thinks about syntax, that's definitely what my experience has been.
So I have a quick follow-up, Jason, if that's okay. So what I'm interested in is the exact text that you are singing from.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and not that other wasn't helpful, but.
Yeah. I think in general, I'm probably talking about Hildegard. That's one thing I'm definitely talking about where I've recognized this from my experience of singing her. Things like the sequence repertoire of Notke Babalus and people like that, you also notice it there. But frankly, with the exception of certain types of plain chant that are either very spare or overly ornate, just in the core Gregorian chant repertoire, you see this going on. So the standard antiphons and so forth, that's where you see, particularly the antiphon repertoire is where you see this happening a lot. There are certain carve-outs I have to make. One big carve-out I would make is a repertoire I've sung a bit of, which is Ambrosian chant, the native chant tradition of Milan, which is mind-numbingly complicated to sing, very exhausting, and seems to have no logic at all, from what I can tell. Incredibly important and interesting, but it doesn't appear to be highly focused on regular periodization of music in association with Latin syntax and phraseology.
Could you say the name one more time?
The Ambrosian. Yeah, from St. Ambrose, named after St. Ambrose. Yeah.
All right. I think we have time for one more question, which I'll read. But I'm sure John would be happy to share his contact information. If people want to continue to follow up, it seems like we've got some serious interest in this here in the audience, and that's great. I also highly recommend his Paideia courses if you'd like to continue interacting with John on some of this stuff. He teaches for us regularly with rave reviews. The last question then is from Brittany Stone, and she asks, is there any evidence of purposeful erasure of female composition from this era?
Again, that's a bit hard to know exactly because there is just so little remaining, not just of women, but of men as well. I'm not aware of any, and in fact, I'd say almost the opposite, because if you think about something like the Codex Las Vegas, for example, it should have been in the firing line in a sense. I mean, it's safeguarded in a royal monastery, which probably does help. But it should have been in the firing line because it was women's music, and it was kind of illicit women's music because it was polyphonic music, which women were not meant to sing, but clearly, evidently did all the time. So I'd say, in a sense, probably the opposite. That the very poor representation that we have of music from the troubadours and the troubadourists, for example, the northern and the southern troubadour, female troubadour tradition, I actually think the lack of music from those people is an accident of history, and it just reminds us that so much has been lost. But I'm not aware of purposeful erasure of women from the historical record. And in fact, what's gone on in more recent scholarship is the recovery of more and more material written by women, particularly in female conventual and monastic settings. So there's tons to be found yet, I'm sure of that. It's just we haven't been attuned to look for it, and we're not always looking in the right places, but we'll find more.
Great. Well, this was just fantastic, John. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm sure everyone will join me in making one of those little symbols for you. It was really super interesting and very rich, and great to hear you sort of talk about your work as well. So I want to thank everyone for coming.
Thank you.
And we will continue to offer these online lectures. The next one, I'm not sure if this is the next one or the one after, but we've got speaking of women in Latin, we've got a wonderful talk from the author of the book, Living with a Dead Language, which is a story of a woman who is a high power literary editor in New York, who then retires and learns Latin in her retirement, and talks about the effect that had on her. So that's coming up. And we've also got a talk that I'm really looking forward to. There's going to be one on the history of people pronouncing Latin in modern languages. So pronunciation of Latin in English and in British English versus American English, et cetera, which is coming up as well. So be sure to catch those. And otherwise, everyone have a great evening or morning, as the case may be, depending on your hemisphere. And we'll catch you next time. Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.